an archaeological finding that blatantly contravened a New Testament reference. He shook his head. Archaeology has not produced anything that is unequivocally a contradiction to the Bible, he replied with confidence. On the contrary, as we've seen, there have been many opinions of skeptical scholars that have become codified into fact over the years, but that archaeology has shown to be wrong. Still, there were some matters I needed to resolve. I pulled out my notes and got ready to challenge McRay with 3 long-standing riddles that I thought archaeology might have some trouble explaining.
Puzzle 1. The census.
The birth narratives of Jesus claim that Mary and Joseph were required by a census to return to Joseph's hometown of Bethlehem. Let me be blunt. This seems absurd on the face of it, I said. How could the government possibly force all of its citizens to return to their birthplace? Is there any archaeological evidence whatsoever that this kind of census ever took place? McRay calmly pulled out a copy of his book. Actually, the discovery of ancient census forms has shed quite a bit of light on this practice, he said as he leafed through the pages. Finding the reference he was searching for, he quoted from an official government order dated AD 104. Gaius Vibius Maximus, prefect of Egypt, says, "Seeing that the time has come for the house-to-house census, it is necessary to compel all those who for any cause whatsoever are residing out of their provinces to return to their own homes, that they may both carry out the regular order of the census and may also attend diligently to the cultivation of their allotments." As you can see, he said as he closed the book, that practice is confirmed by this document, even though this particular manner of counting people may seem odd to you. And another papyrus, this one from AD 48, indicates that the entire family was involved in the census. What's more, scholars have pointed out that to avoid inflaming the population, Romans were known to sometimes let a census be taken on the basis of local customs. In the Jewish culture, this would mean that Mary and Joseph would need to register in their ancestral home. This, however, did not entirely dispose of the issue. Luke said the census that brought Joseph and Mary to Bethlehem was conducted when Quirinius was governing Syria and during the reign of Herod the Great. That poses a significant problem, I pointed out, because Herod died in 4 BC and Quirinius didn't begin ruling Syria until AD 6, conducting the census soon after that. There's a big gap there. How can you deal with such a major discrepancy in the dates? McRay knew I was raising an issue that scholars have wrestled with for years. He responded by telling me about a recent report by an archaeologist that he had found very small writings or micrographic letters on coins that showed Quirinius was a ruler in Syria and Cilicia from 11 BC until after Herod's death. This would mean there were 2 different officials named Quirinius, and the census would have taken place under an earlier one during the reign of Herod. This sounded a bit speculative to me, but rather than bog down the conversation, I decided to mentally file this issue away for later analysis. As it turned out, the archaeologist referenced by McRay died shortly after McRay and I spoke. He had never written any peer-review articles on his finding, and nobody has replicated his discovery. In the end, experts dismissed his claim. When I did some additional research, I found that Sir William Ramsay, the late archaeologist and professor at both Oxford and Cambridge universities in England, believed that Quirinius was ruler in Syria on 2 separate occasions, which would cover the time period of an earlier census, which Ramsay dated around 8 or 7 BC. However, this earlier census is not mentioned anywhere in the historical record. Still, this would not be surprising if there had been no disturbances that warranted the attention of Josephus or other ancient historians. Questions have also been raised about the idea that the Romans would have ordered a census in Syria when it wasn't yet fully enfolded into the Roman Empire. But there is precedent for Rome ordering censuses in client states. Harold W. Hockner, who earned his doctorate at Cambridge, pointed out that Herod was ill and came into conflict with the Roman Emperor Augustus in 8 to 7 BC. With such instability and such a bad state of health, it would have been an opportune time for Augustus to have had a census taken in order to assess the situation before Herod's death, he said. Therefore, a census within the last year or two of Herod's reign would have been reasonable and, in fact, most probable. Said New Testament professor Darrell L. Bach, a census in Herod's time requiring a journey by Joseph and Mary is a possibility based on what we know of Roman practice. That no other source mentions such a census is not a significant problem, since many ancient sources refer to events that are not corroborated elsewhere, and since Luke is found to be trustworthy in his handling of facts that one can check. Since the details of this census fit into general Roman tax policy, there is no need to question that it could have occurred in the time of Herod. But what about Luke's claim concerning Quirinius? Some scholars have pointed out that Luke's text could be translated, "This census took place before Quirinius was governing Syria," which would resolve the problem. Said Hochner, this gives a good sense to the passage at hand, although some scholars have disagreed with this rendering. Other possibilities have been discussed. The solutions to the Quirinius problem are varied, Bach said. No candidate is so manifestly superior that it can be regarded as the solution. What one faces is a variety of solutions, any of which could be correct. But one other fact seemed especially persuasive to me. Luke could not have been referencing the AD 6 census because this would mean he would be contradicting himself. How? Hochner points out that Luke was well aware of the AD 6 census, which he references in Acts 5, verse 37. But Luke was also aware that Jesus could not have been born that late, since he and Matthew concur the birth occurred under Herod. See Luke 1, verse 5, and Matthew 2, verse 1. Further, Luke said Jesus was about 30 years old when he started his ministry. Luke 3, verse 23. This would have been shortly after the start of John the Baptist's ministry, which Luke dates around AD 27 to 29. See Luke 3, verses 1 and 2. The implication is clear. If the census had been in AD 6, Jesus would only have been 21 to 23 years old when he started his ministry. But Luke knew he was older than that. Therefore, said Hochner, Luke could not have been referencing the AD 6 census when he wrote about Jesus' birth. Certainly, he said, Luke was conscious of chronology in his works. That made sense to me. Luke was an astute historian who would not have made such a fundamental error of contradicting himself. There must have been an earlier census that prompted the journey of Joseph and Mary, a census that would have occurred during the reign of Herod, as Luke reported. After assessing the various scenarios, Bach concluded, it is clear that the relegation of the census account in Luke to the category of historical error is premature and erroneous.
Puzzle 2. Existence of Nazareth.
Many Christians are unaware that skeptics have been asserting for a long time that Nazareth never existed during the time when the New Testament says Jesus spent his childhood there. In an article called Where Jesus Never Walked, atheist Frank Zindler noted that Nazareth is not mentioned in the Old Testament by the Apostle Paul, by the Talmud, although 63 other Galilean towns are cited, or by Josephus, who listed 45 other villages and cities of Galilee, including Jaffa, which is located just over a mile from present-day Nazareth. No ancient historians or geographers mention Nazareth before the beginning of the 4th century. The name first appears in Jewish literature in a poem written about the 7th century A.D. This absence of evidence paints a suspicious picture. So I put the issue directly to McRay. Is there any archaeological confirmation that Nazareth was in existence during the 1st century? This issue wasn't new to McRay. Dr. James Strange of the University of South Florida is an expert on this area, and he describes Nazareth as being a very small place, about 60 acres, with a maximum population of about 480 at the beginning of the 1st century. In 1962, archaeologists reported the discovery of a list in Aramaic describing the 24 courses or families of priests who were relocated after the Jerusalem temple was destroyed in AD 70. One course was moved to Nazareth, which would show that this village must have been in existence. However, other archaeologists later raised questions about this finding. McRay also mentioned that there have been archaeological digs that uncovered first-century tombs in the vicinity of Nazareth. 2 tombs contained objects such as pottery lamps, glass vessels, and vases from the 1st, 3rd, or 4th centuries. McRay picked up a copy of a book by archaeologist Jack Finnegan, published by Princeton University Press. He leafed through it, then read Finnegan's analysis. From the tombs, it can be concluded that Nazareth was a strongly Jewish settlement in the Roman period. McRay looked up at me. There has been discussion about the location of some sites from the 1st century, such as exactly where Jesus' tomb is situated. But among archaeologists, there has never really been a big doubt about the location of Nazareth. The burden of proof ought to be on those who dispute its existence. That burden became more difficult in subsequent years, after the discovery of 2 houses from 1st century Nazareth. In 2006, the Nazareth Archaeological Project began excavating beneath the Sisters of Nazareth Convent, a location known since 1880. The director of the project, Ken Dark of the University of Reading, described the remains of a 1st century home that was found. Taken together, the walls conform to the plan of a so-called courtyard house, one of the typical architectural forms of early Roman period settlements in Galilee, Dark said. Archaeologists found doors and windows, cooking pottery, and a spindle whorl used in spinning thread. Fragments of limestone vessels, which Jews believed could not become impure, were also found, suggesting a Jewish family lived there. The home must date from the 1st century AD or earlier, Dark concluded. No stratified pottery earlier or later than the early Roman period was discovered in layers associated with the house. Another 1st century house, similar in structure, was discovered nearby in an excavation by Yardina Alexandra of the Israel Antiquities Authority in 2009. Such evidence would be consistent with what archaeologists of the Roman provinces elsewhere conventionally term a small town, Dark said. The evidence suggests that Jesus' boyhood was spent in a conservative Jewish community that had little contact with Hellenistic or Roman culture. Some people have wondered whether Dark's team may have actually found the very home where Jesus grew up. While clues from later centuries suggest Byzantines may have believed that this was the home where Jesus spent his childhood, Dark concluded that it is impossible to say on archaeological grounds. On the other hand, there is no good archaeological reason why such an identification should be discounted. Regardless, the case for the existence of Nazareth in the 1st century has gotten stronger over the years. Puzzle 3. Slaughter at Bethlehem. The Gospel of Matthew paints a grisly scene. Herod the Great, the king of Judea, feeling threatened by the birth of a baby whom he feared would eventually seize his throne, dispatches his troops to murder all the children under the age of 2 in Bethlehem. Warned by an angel, however, Joseph escapes to Egypt with Mary and Jesus. Only after Herod dies do they return to settle in Nazareth, the entire episode having fulfilled 3 ancient prophecies about the Messiah. See Matthew 2, verses 13 through 23. The problem? There is no independent confirmation that this mass murder ever took place. There's nothing in the writings of Josephus or other historians. There's no archaeological support. There are no records or documents. Certainly, an event of this magnitude would have been noticed by someone other than Matthew, I insisted. With the complete absence of any historical or archaeological corroboration, isn't it logical to conclude that this slaughter never occurred? I can see why you'd say that, McRay replied, since today an event like that would probably be splashed all over CNN and the rest of the news media. I agreed. In fact, in 1997 and 1998, there was a steady stream of news accounts about Muslim extremists repeatedly staging commando raids and slaying virtually entire villages, including women and children, in Algeria. The entire world was taking notice. But, added McRay, you have to put yourself back in the first century and keep a few things in mind. First, Bethlehem was probably no bigger than Nazareth. So how many babies of that age would there be in a village of 500 or 600 people? Not thousands, not hundreds, although certainly a few. Second, Herod the Great was a bloodthirsty king. He killed members of his own family. He executed lots of people who he thought might challenge him. So the fact that he killed some babies in Bethlehem is not going to captivate the attention of people in the Roman world. And third, there was no television, no radio, no newspapers. It would have taken a long time for word of this to get out, especially from such a minor village way in the back hills of nowhere, and historians had much bigger stories to write about. As a journalist, this was still hard to fathom. This just wasn't much of a story? I asked, a bit incredulous. I don't think it was, at least not in those days, he said. A madman killing everybody who seems to be a potential threat to him? That was business as usual for Herod. Later, of course, as Christianity developed, this incident became more important. But I would have been surprised if this had made a big splash back then. Maybe so, but this was difficult to imagine for a journalist who was trained to sniff out news in a highly technological age of rapid and worldwide communications. At the same time, I had to acknowledge that from what I knew of the bloody landscape of ancient Palestine, McRay's explanation did seem reasonable. This left one other area I wanted to inquire about, and to me, it was the most fascinating of all. Admittedly, there is an allure to archaeology. Ancient tombs, cryptic inscriptions etched in stone or scratched onto papyrus, bits of broken pottery, worn coins, they're tantalizing clues for an inveterate investigator. But few vestiges of the past have generated as much intrigue as the Dead Sea Scrolls. Hundreds of manuscripts dating from 250 BC to AD 68 that were found in caves 20 miles east of Jerusalem in 1947. They apparently had been hidden by a strict sect of Jews called the Essenes before the Romans destroyed their settlement. Some bizarre claims have been made about the scrolls, including John Marco Allegro's absurd book in which he theorized that Christianity emerged from a fertility cult in which adherents tripped out on hallucinogenic mushrooms. In a more legitimate but nevertheless much questioned assertion, papyri expert Jose O'Callaghan said one Dead Sea fragment is part of the earliest manuscript ever found of the Gospel of Mark, dating back to a mere 17 to 20 years after Jesus was crucified. However, scholars continue to be skeptical of his interpretation. In any event, no inquiry into the archaeology of the first century would be complete without asking about the scrolls. Do they tell us anything directly about Jesus? I asked McRay. Well, no, Jesus isn't specifically mentioned in any of the scrolls, he replied. Primarily, these documents give us insights into Jewish life and customs. Then he pulled out some papers and pointed to an article that was published in late 1997. Although, he added, there is a very interesting development involving a manuscript called 4Q521 that could tell us something about who Jesus was claiming to be. That whet my appetite. Tell me about it, I said, with some urgency in my voice. McRay unfolded the mystery. The Gospel of Matthew describes how John the Baptist, imprisoned and wrestling with lingering doubts about Jesus' identity, sent his followers to ask Jesus this monumental question: Are you the one who is to come, or should we expect someone else? Matthew 11, verse 3. He was seeking a straight answer about whether Jesus really was the long-awaited Messiah. Through the centuries, Christians have wondered about Jesus' rather enigmatic answer. Instead of directly saying yes or no, Jesus replied, "Go back and report to John what you hear and see. The blind receive sight, the lame walk, those who have leprosy are cleansed, the deaf hear, the dead are raised, and the good news is proclaimed to the poor." Matthew 11, verses 4 and 5. Jesus' response was an allusion to Isaiah 35. But for some reason, Jesus included the phrase, "the dead are raised," which is conspicuously absent from the Old Testament text. This is where Q4521 comes in. This non-biblical manuscript from the Dead Sea collection, written in Hebrew, dates back to 30 years before Jesus was born. It contains a version of Isaiah 61 that does include this missing phrase, "the dead are raised." Scroll scholar Craig Evans has pointed out that this phrase in 4Q521 is unquestionably embedded in a messianic context, McRay said. It refers to the wonders that the Messiah will do when he comes, and when heaven and earth will obey him. So when Jesus gave this response to John, he was not being ambiguous at all. John would have instantly recognized his words as a distinct claim that Jesus was the Messiah. McRay tossed me the article in which Evans was quoted as saying, 4Q521 makes it clear that Jesus' appeal to Isaiah 35 is indeed messianic. In essence, Jesus is telling John through his messengers that messianic things are happening. So that answers John's question. Yes, he is the one who is to come. I sat back in my chair. To me, Evans' discovery was a remarkable confirmation of Jesus' self-identity. It was staggering to me how modern archaeology could finally unlock the significance of a statement in which Jesus boldly asserted nearly 2,000 years ago that he was indeed the anointed one of God. Archaeology's repeated affirmation of the New Testament's accuracy provides important corroboration for its reliability. This is in stark contrast with how archaeology has proved to be devastating for Mormonism. Although Joseph Smith, the founder of the Mormon Church, claimed that his Book of Mormon is the most correct of any book upon the earth, archaeology has repeatedly failed to substantiate its claims about events that supposedly occurred long ago in the Americas. I remember writing to the Smithsonian Institute to inquire about whether there was any evidence supporting the claims of Mormonism, only to be told in unequivocal terms that its archaeologists see no direct connection between the archaeology of the New World and the subject matter of the book. As authors John Ankerberg and John Weldon concluded in a book on the topic, in other words, no Book of Mormon cities have ever been located, no Book of Mormon person, place, nation, or name has ever been found, no Book of Mormon artifacts, no Book of Mormon scriptures, no Book of Mormon inscriptions, nothing which demonstrates the Book of Mormon is anything other than myth or invention has ever been found. However, the story is totally different for the New Testament. McRay's conclusions have been echoed by many other scientists, including prominent Australian archaeologist Clifford Wilson, who wrote, "Those who know the facts now recognize that the New Testament must be accepted as a remarkably accurate source book." With Craig Blomberg having established the essential reliability of the New Testament documents, Bruce Metzger having confirmed their accurate transmittal through history, Edwin Yamauchi having demonstrated extensive corroboration by ancient historians and others, and now John McRay having shown how archaeology underscores their trustworthiness, I had to agree with Wilson. The case for Christ, while far from complete, was being constructed on solid bedrock. At the same time, I knew there were some high-profile professors who would dissent from that assessment. You've seen them quoted in Newsweek and being interviewed on the evening news, talking about their radical reassessment of Jesus. The time had come for me to confront their critiques head-on before I went any further in my investigation. That meant a trip to Minnesota to interview a feisty, Yale-educated scholar named Dr. Gregory Boyd.